Queer Representation in Horror Films by Justin Lamb for WGS 3010 with Professor Lacey Story. Like many children of the 80s and 90s, I was a child raised on television and movies. From a very early age, perhaps too early, I was exposed to the legendary horror villains of Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. My love for the cult classic horror films exploded with the release of Scream in 1996. At only 13 years old, I was able to understand all of the movie references in that film. I had seen Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and many more as I perused the horror aisle at my local Blockbuster. I loved Scream and Nev Campbell so much and followed the franchise closely and obsessively all the way to the most recent release, its fifth installment, also titled Scream. I noticed that one of the characters in the new Scream was queer. It wasn't part of the plot or something important to the story. It was just an aspect of the character that made them who they were. This got me thinking about how it's taken this long to have a queer character in a very successful franchise created and written by a queer writer. That's crazy. 25 years? So I went down a rabbit hole, and that is the hole I will be presenting to you. In the early days of cinema, the production code was adopted, also known as the Hays Code after Will Hays, the then president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. This is so-called moral code set forth rules such as no sexually explicit content. Good guys always win, bad guys always lose. No swearing and saying offensive things. Nothing that promotes quote-unquote bad values or perversion. Values at this time and in the industry were typically defined in religious texts, specifically using Catholicism in the wording of the code itself. And as far as perversion, the subtext to be understood on this by all filmmakers during that period was that you couldn't show homosexuality, and in the rare circumstances you did, it better fall in line with the bad guys always lose, meaning that no homosexual characters could be shown in a good light if they were shown at all. This was a huge time for films, too. During World War II, people flocked to the cinema in droves, distracting themselves from the terrible things happening in the world. Films began to come out in color as well, driving more traffic to the cinema. Like Hawley and Escherman note in 2017 Seeing Straight, in our society, heterosexuality is understood to be normal. The process from which we come to make the choices we make, to do what we do, and to think what we think springs from our society. It's because cinema was so popular that these restrictions really helped play into the narrative that homosexuality or any aspect of queer culture was bad and abnormal. Welcome to the 70s, aka lesbian vampires and trans icons. As if picking up where we left off in the 1930s horror film Dracula's Daughter, about a young woman queer vampire looking to do the equivalent of pray the gay away, the now popular trope of queer villains combined with the repeal of the Hays Code allowed for more sexualized content. The 70s brought us a plethora of lesbian vampires in films like The Vampire Lovers, The Daughters of Darkness, and The Blood-Spattered Bride, offering a double-edged sword in the theater of more lesbian representation, while still promoting the theme of sexuality being monstrous and highly erotic and sexualized. The 70s also brought forth one lesser-known trans story as well as one trans icon. The film Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde is a gender twist on a classic tale of two personalities, and explores scenes and situations like a man buying women's clothing for his alter ego. The most popular trans character to come out of 70s horror, though, and I use the term horror loosely here, is none other than Frank-N-Furter in Rocky Horror Picture Show. Originally portrayed by Tim Curry, this character has been redone at every Halloween party since the year it came out. The film itself is now viewed near the top of a hierarchy of queer-themed films. This tongue-in-cheek play on the classic Frankenstein has Tim Curry's character decked out in drag, creating a Frankenstein-esque boy toy and seducing men and women alike throughout the musical film. The 80s. Oh, the 80s. Famous for ambiguity. It's a decade notorious for ambiguity in pop culture, from long-haired men, short-haired women, both of whom wear tights, to the crop tops, bright quote-unquote feminine colors, and the high-pitched singers. The outright homosexual or queer narratives, while getting more steam in America culture as a whole, especially with the growing AIDS pandemic, are seemingly absent in horror films. And this decade pumped out over 190 different horror films. Going with the theme of the decade, however, there are many ambiguous characters and stories that have become quite famous in modern queer culture. To borrow a term from Bruce Henderson, author of Queer Studies, if we were to queer the popular horror films of the 80s, meaning to look at them through the lens that do not simply accept the givens we may have been taught, we see films like Fright Night, The Lost Boys, and Hellraiser. Among many other films, especially vampire ones, have quintessential themes of queer representation and queer culture. This is particularly true with Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge, in which the main character, played by a gay actor who was then closeted, is often debated as being written as gay, though it is never mentioned. The writer of the film, David Chaskin, also himself gay, later revealed that after adamantly denying it for decades, that all of the homosexual undertones of many scenes, including a famous shower scene, were not a mistake, and he did in fact write it as a queer film and a commentary on the ongoing AIDS crisis. The 80s and 90s brought two important setbacks for the trans community that were immortalized in film, both of which have the villain portrayed as trans in one way or another. These films are Sleepaway Camp and Silence of the Lambs. Should be noted, Sleepaway Camp was one of the films that set me down this course in wondering what trans representation looked like, since this film did not age well. In Sleepaway Camp, the killer, who turns out to be a teenage girl, is revealed to have a penis, and her psychotic homicidal episode is implied to be caused by her trying to work through being a trans person. In The Silence of the Lambs, the killer in this haunting psychological horror film is portrayed as a cross-dressing man and helps to perpetuate the stereotype that men in women's clothing are perverse and dangerous. The Silence of the Lambs, in particular, was protested by Queer Nation when it was nominated and subsequently won 5 of the most coveted Oscars. The 90s. While queer characters were showing up all over the place in the 90s in films like Clueless and TV shows like Ellen and Dawson's Creek, the horror world was relatively quiet. The genre itself had sputtered out from oversaturation and was in need of something new. Enter Scream. Scream. Noted in the beginning of this presentation, there are no queer characters in Scream, but if we borrow Henderson's term of queering again, there is a lens which the two killers in the film, Billy and Stu, are theorized as being lovers, especially since the film was written by an openly gay man who has hinted in interviews that some of their relationship was written with that potential in mind. The new century bringing openly queer characters in pretty much every genre of film. In horror specifically, there are two especially noteworthy films. You see here Seed of Chucky and Jennifer's Body. In Seed of Chucky, the umpteenth sequel to its 80s predecessor about a doll imbibed with the soul of a murderer, Chucky and his doll bride have a child who openly struggles with their gender identity as part of the main theme of the film. In Jennifer's Body, Megan Fox plays a man-eating demon high school girl in a complicated relationship with her best friend and possible lover, played by Amanda Seyfried. These are in addition to a bunch more low-budget indie horror films in which some or all of the central characters of the film are queer. The second decade of the century finally begins to bring normalization to queer characters and storylines, placing them in lead roles or simply having them represented in the cast of random horror movie misfits. This can be seen in films like All Cheerleaders Die, a rape revenge film in which the main character is a lesbian high school girl, The Perfection, in which the main character are both involved in a romantic relationship with each other, even though the rest of this film is really stomach-curdling, and the biggest surprise of all queer icons, The Babadook. Yes, this film gained notoriety in queer circles when Netflix reportedly placed it under the LGBTQ category by mistake. This led to a deep dive theory about the androgynous gender of the large overcoat-wearing character in the film, labeling them as a non-binary icon. Today, the presence of queer characters and stories continues to be present and celebrated in horror films. Just last year, Netflix released a 3-film series called Fear Street, in which the main character is in love with her best friend, who loves her back but is dealing with the fallout of potentially being publicly out of the closet. Then this year, as mentioned in the beginning of the film, the 5th installment of the Scream series was released and included a queer character in the ensemble cast of potential killers or victims. No spoilers, marking the first queer character in a series that was created by one of the most prolific queer writers in film and television. In conclusion, inclusion. That's what it's all about. Queer characters have had a role in horror films from the very beginning, but it was always in subtext or as an example of perversion in the bad guy. Even though the production code was repealed in 1968, society as a whole had to change in order to allow more films to come out with queer characters and stories that ran alongside hero characters and stories, not as villains, out metaphorically to kill the heteronormative lifestyle. Horror as a genre has always been a place that filmmakers felt free to really do whatever they want. It's been a testing ground for what can be done in films of a more popular genre. It's because of this that it's so important to spotlight queer characters in this genre and make sure we continue to normalize queer storylines across the board, making sure we do not fall into the tropes we become used to, such as queer villains and monsters. Thank you, and sorry for any spoilers.